Tonight we're going to kind of the start of most second Sunday nights. There'll certainly be exceptions all along the way. But most second Sunday nights is going to be a lesson I'm calling Tough Questions. And tonight's not such a tough question, but it is a subject that we've hardly looked at or considered from the pulpit and Bible class over the years. And in the future, though, some will be truly tough questions, some that are very hard to answer or hard to maybe even find a clear answer to. I find that sometimes people ask questions, and I have questions that sometimes the Bible really doesn't direct itself to a specific or direct answer. Sometimes answers can be derived at through implications, and then otherwise sometimes there's a great, shall we say, realm of opinion and judgment on some of those questions. Not tonight, though. Tonight we're going to look at the Sabbath or not the Sabbath, and basically that is, well, what about the Sabbath day? And I believe the Bible is very clear about the subject of the Sabbath day. However, you would find religious groups, for instance, primarily Seventh-day Adventist church, that, well, they meet on Saturday the Sabbath. There are even some Seventh-day Baptist churches, though that would be kind of few and far between. Years ago, Herbert W. Armstrong began a radio program. Later, there became a TV program, and he eventually named his religious group the Worldwide Church of God. His teachings required observance of parts of the Mosaic Law, including seventh-day Sabbath, dietary prohibitions, and the covenant law of holy days. So there's various religious groups, even now, that would say we must keep the seventh day or the Sabbath. Well, what about the Sabbath? Well, we do find that after God created the world in 6 days, He rested on the Sabbath day, seventh day. You see, in Genesis chapter 2, verses 1 and 2, you don't have the word Sabbath, just have mention of 6 days created, seventh day rested. And then you find in a very specific way, He blessed and sanctified the seventh day, Genesis 2, verse 3. The seventh day later became known as the Sabbath day, the Hebrew Shabbath, meaning to rest from labor, and then the Greek word Sabbaton, and thus it came to mean the day of rest. Now, there's basically 3 questions that arise concerning the Sabbath day. First is, what day of the week was the Sabbath day? And that's questions then usually Saturday or Sunday. And part of the confusion for this is many times you'll find people speak of a Christian Sabbath. It's truly a misnomer. And then they would apply that to Sunday. So that creates kind of a misunderstanding about Sabbath. Secondly, are Christians to keep the Sabbath? And then third is Sunday now, the Christian Sabbath. About the Sabbath day, the first question, well, what day is the Sabbath? That's not difficult to come up with. Not at all. We find, of course, that after those 6 days of creation, then there was that seventh day of rest, though the word Sabbath is not used in Genesis 2. You have to go rather to Exodus chapter 20, to the 10 Commandments, and find there that He is very, very, very specific about the Sabbath day is the seventh day of the Lord. And if a person reads through Exodus chapter 20 and they misunderstand what day of the week Sabbath is, they slept for about 3 verses. It is the seventh day. According to Jewish reckoning, the seventh day began at sunset on Friday, ended at sunset on Saturday. That would be the way Jews kept their time when their day started. So thus in the Bible, the Sabbath generally refers to Saturday. Now the reason I say generally is, and we could almost say almost exclusively, but you get over to the book of Hebrews and he speaks of a Sabbath rest that remaineth for the people of God. I don't think there he's talking about Saturday, the seventh day of the week. But generally, when you see the word Sabbath, think in terms of the seventh day. But now here's something very interesting. As we start talking about, well, now who was to keep the Sabbath? It was not commanded of the patriarchs. That is, throughout the book of Genesis, there was no command about the Sabbath, and the word Sabbath day never occurs in the book of Genesis. The first time actually is in Exodus. From Adam to Moses, there's no mention of the Sabbath. According to Justin Martyr, moreover, all those righteous men already mentioned, after he had mentioned Adam, Abel, Enoch, Lot, Noah, Melchizedek, and Abraham, though they kept no Sabbaths, were pleasing to God, and after them Abraham and all his descendants until Moses. He lived about midway through the 2nd century. Similar to what he wrote, we find Tertullian said, God originated Adam uncircumcised and unobservant of the Sabbath. Consequently, his offspring also, Abel, offering him sacrifices, uncircumcised and unobservant of the Sabbath, was by him commended. Noah also, uncircumcised, yes, and unobservant of the Sabbath, God freed from the deluge. For Enoch too, who was the most righteous man, uncircumcised and unobservant of the Sabbath, he translated from this world. Melchizedek also, the priest of the Most High, uncircumcised and unobservant of the Sabbath, was chosen to the priesthood of God. And so here Tertullian makes these observations of these patriarchs, these men living in that period of Genesis, and righteous and faithful men, though they were uncircumcised, living prior to the law of circumcision. Unobservant is the word that's used there. Well, they did not observe, he's saying, the Sabbath. And as you would read through the book of Genesis, and as you read through everything about these men, you'd have to come to the same conclusion as Tertullian. There's no implication that they observed the Sabbath. But now someone might say, but wait, what about Genesis chapter 2, verse 3? So God blessed the seventh day and made it holy. We would point out that he does make mention of the seventh day there, but he does not speak of the word Sabbath. In fact, you don't find it until you get on into the book of Exodus. Now, the reason about this seventh day is because on it God rested from all his work that he had done in creation. And so while there was a recognition here of God in Genesis 2, verse 3, and it could be too recognized that as Moses writes this, Moses is writing this years and years and years later than the actual, well, who lived in Genesis 2 and Genesis 3? Adam and Eve. So post Adam and Eve and all the patriarchs and etc., all the way until Moses, you don't even have this written. And so sometimes we may want to think, well, did Adam observe the seventh day? There's nothing made mention of it other than how God viewed the seventh day at that point. Although God, and this is Believer's Bible Commentary, although God did not command man to keep the Sabbath at this time, he taught the principle of one day of rest in 7. What we do find, if we're going to speak from authority, if we're going to speak very directly to what we can know about the Sabbath day, is God did command the Sabbath day for the Israelites. You find it first mentioned in your Bible in Exodus 16, beginning in verse 23. And that was in regards to Israel collecting manna. And this was shortly after the exodus of Israel from Egypt. And this was when God actually blessed and sanctified the seventh day as a day of rest. Realize we're going all the way through the book of Genesis, all the way to the 16th chapter of Exodus, all the way from Adam until the exodus of the Israelites from Egypt, without a mention of the word Sabbath or even the institution of Sabbath. And you have to get to Exodus 16 before we find it commanded, and then specifically it was for the Israelites. And as you find in Nehemiah 9, 13, and 14, what I want you to see here, or emphasized here, is that it was to the Israelites. You read, you came down on Mount Sinai. Well, Mount Sinai, immediately the bells go off in our mind. The 10 Commandments, the giving of the law. You came down from Mount Sinai, spoke with them from heaven, and gave them right rules and true laws, good statutes and commandments. And you made known to them your holy Sabbath, and commanded them commandments and statutes by a law by Moses your servant. So here we have identified the place and the individual by which the Sabbath law was made to the Israelites. And then that, of course, then keys us in on a time. The Ten Commandments, as it was then a part of the law, commanded of the Israelites. But we would also observe that it was never commanded for the Gentiles. All the commandments regarding the Sabbath are directed toward Israel and no other nation. Now there was the exception, and that is in Exodus 20:10, you read about the stranger who is within your gates. And likely this exception was to prevent being influenced to disobey. In other words, it's kind of like, you're with us, we do Sabbath, seventh day. You may be an outsider, you may be a foreigner, but if you're with us, you're going to do it too. We find, as we turn though to the New Testament, we find much about Jesus and the Sabbath. And realize it was Jesus, of course, living under yet and still that Old Testament law of Moses when the observance of the Sabbath was commanded. We find that Jesus taught in the synagogues on the Sabbath. We also find that His actions on the Sabbath sometimes spark controversy. Remember that His allowing His disciples to pluck grain on the Sabbath in order to eat? Pharisees didn't like it. Also, there was the healing on the Sabbath in multiple places. Once again, the Pharisees did not like it, and they called Him to task on this. And then Jesus countered their objections. He did so by showing their ignorance of the law, by professing to be Lord even of the Sabbath, and by pointing out their inconsistencies. We would also see that these following observations should be made. The law of Moses was still in effect prior to the death of Christ. Thus, Jesus observing the Sabbath. And as an Israelite, Jesus kept the law. That, of course, included the Sabbath. And He displayed authority to forgive sin and interpret the law. There is nothing to indicate that Jesus extended the Sabbath to all nations, however. We find, if we were to say Old Testament, the Sabbath commanded and joined upon the Jews, not the Gentiles. You get to the New Testament, Jesus, as living under the law, He observed the seventh day, the Sabbath. No indication He extended it to all nations. Continued to be an observance and a command for the Jews. Well, then as we get on into the book of Acts, we might ask the question, well, what about the apostles and the Sabbath? We find that the apostles were to pray that their flight from tribulation, the destruction of Jerusalem, might not be on the Sabbath, Matthew 24, verse 20. And of course, if it was on the Sabbath, that would have made the escape from Jerusalem more difficult. We find also that in Judea, Jews would still be observing the Sabbath, and that meant closing the gates and thereby hindering their flight. This does not indicate whether or not the Sabbath was still bound by God. Rather, the Jews were still observing it. We find also that Paul utilized the Sabbath during his evangelistic efforts. You see, his custom was, as he would go into a new city, he would go into the synagogue on the Sabbath, and that's where he found those people he could initially connect with that understand and knew better, for instance, the law in the Old Testament, so he could then begin to preach Jesus. He also would have an opportunity because men were allowed up to read and give a sense of the law. And so he was provided with an opportunity, and he took it. And so as his custom was, he would go into a new town, go into that synagogue, and thereby teach. And then we'd also find he went into the marketplace to reach others. You find this in a particular way as he went into Athens, where lacking the synagogue, he sees much idolatry. Well, we then begin to say, okay, what about now the apostles and Christians and the Sabbath day? Well, the Sabbath was a part of the law of Moses. Understand that. And Paul taught that the law of Moses, including the Sabbath, had come to an end. In Romans chapter 7, you read about the Jews. They died to the law when they became Christians. And you find that Jesus ended the law with its ordinances through his death, as you'd read in Ephesians chapter 2 and in Colossians chapter 2. And so what we're seeing is that Christ has redeemed us from the curse of the law. Now I know sometimes when we study this and look at this, people might then ask, well, wait a minute. Does this mean I'm not to observe the 10 Commandments? Well, that's kind of a yes and a no. 9 of the 10 Commandments we would find elsewhere within the New Testament, implied, spoken of explicitly perhaps, but there's one that's not. That one is observe the Sabbath day, honor the Sabbath day, and to keep it holy, Exodus 20 verse 8. That's the one actually you don't find within the New Testament. The law and ordinances like the Sabbath and circumcision should not be bound on others, especially the Gentiles, as you would consider then a discussion at times about, well, what do we do with these Gentiles in the church, and what do we do with the law, and what do we do in a specific way with circumcision? Not to be bound on the Gentiles. There is a new superior covenant that had replaced the old, and that is the New Testament law of Jesus Christ. That's to be followed, that's to be observed. And so, see, to this point, basically what we have noticed is that the Sabbath was a part of the old law, not even patriarch period, but a part of that time the law of Moses had been given to Israel. To Israel, not the greater world at large, not to the Gentiles. And then getting to the point of the apostles and that New Testament law of Christ, we're finding an absolute lack of instruction or enjoining or commandment concerning following and honoring the Sabbath day. Following the New Testament law of Christ, we find there's another day that Christians worship. They taught that observing the Sabbath day was no longer necessary, though Jewish Christians sometimes continued to observe some elements of the law, and Paul himself did so on occasion. But no, the Sabbath was not enjoined or commanded. Paul, in fact, drew a clear line. The law could not be bound on Gentiles. Go back and read Acts 15, because that's when that occasion came of questioning, well, what do we do with these Gentiles in the church? And so then an observation made as that group assembled. And no, they were not to be bound to that law of Moses. And so, in fact, those who would try to bind the law of Moses upon Christians made an occasion or a necessary reason for Paul to write. And you find that several epistles, Romans and Galatians, Colossians, Ephesians, much in the book of Hebrews, whether written by Paul or not, points out a distinction between the old law and the new law. And we are under that new law of Jesus Christ. The law, that old law, could not serve as a basis for their salvation. But if an individual desired to keep one day above another, that was between the individual and the Lord. Now, about a conclusion of, well, what about the apostles and the Sabbath? There's nothing in the apostolic practice and writings to suggest that the Sabbath was made a part of the new covenant of Jesus Christ. If we were to kind of move beyond, we've looked at Old Testament, we've looked at Jesus, we've looked at the apostles in the New Testament. We even go beyond that and look at the Sabbath in church history. We find that nothing binds the Sabbath keeping on the church, either explicitly or implicitly in the New Testament. In fact, in church history, first church history took place in the Bible itself. Acts 20 verse 7. What did the church do? On the first day of the week, when they were gathered together to break bread, Paul talked to them, intending to depart on the next day and prolonged his speech until midnight. So we see there it's on the first day of the week. And once again, even a casual reader of Exodus chapter 20 verses 8 through about 11 will see that the Sabbath is the seventh day of the Lord. Not the first day, the seventh day. Yet here, it was on the first day of the week that the Christians gathered to break bread and Paul preached. Further, we find in 1 Corinthians 16, 1 and 2. And now, an interesting thing to observe here is obviously Acts 20, verse 7 was not an isolated event. But rather, as you get to 1 Corinthians 16, 1 and 2, and we might say, the church at Corinth. But notice as you begin to read, now concerning the collection for the saints, as I directed the churches of Galatia. So it's not just Acts 20, verse 7. It's not just Corinth, 1 Corinthians 16, verses 1 and 2. But it's also the churches of Galatia. And so we see that here's a pattern developing. Here's a commonality of the Lord's church. That verse 2, on the first day of every week, each of you is to put something aside and store it up, as he may prosper, so that there be no collecting when I come. Now, Acts 20, verse 7 had to do with the Lord's Supper and preaching. But the day we saw it happening was the first day of the week. Here in this passage, the emphasis and the teaching is about the giving. But again, what day is it? It's the first day of the week. So we again see a contrast. Not the seventh day, not the Sabbath, but the first day of the week. So the inspired history is saying the church met on the first day of the week, on Sunday. Now, if we were to move beyond the New Testament to church fathers, and let me just observe this. We move beyond the New Testament. We are not on inspired ground. What Origen or Tertullian or any of those fellows said is not inspired. But it is interesting by observation to see what they had to say about when the church was meeting. We find from the Epistle of Barnabas, about 100 AD, we keep the 8th day, which would be Sunday, with joyfulness, the day also in which Jesus rose again from the dead, not the 7th day. We find, according to Justin, who was about 150 AD, and on the day called Sunday, all who live in cities or in the country gather together in one place, and the memoirs of the apostles or the writings of the prophets are read, as long as time permits. Again, Sunday, which would be the first day of the week. From that same individual, he said, but Sunday is the day on which we all hold our common assembly, because it is the first day on which God, having wrought a change in the darkness and matter, made the world, and Jesus Christ, our Savior, on the same day rose from the dead. As we move on beyond just church fathers, Encyclopedia Britannica says Sunday, the first day of the week in Christianity, the Lord's Day, the weekly memorial of Jesus Christ's resurrection from the dead, the practice of Christians gathering together for worship on Sunday dates back to apostolic times. So here the writer of this particular article, Encyclopedia Britannica, has done his research well to see not only that it was the Lord's Day, the first day of the week, the significance of it, that it was a memorial of Jesus Christ's resurrection from the dead. We find Encyclopedia Americana, from the apostolic era to the present, it has been customary for Christians to assemble for communal Sunday services. And so once again, if we were to say what was the common practice of those who call themselves Christians from apostolic times onward, even beyond the Bible time itself, it has been that Christians came together on the first day of the week. According to Philip Schaff, The History of the Christian Church, he says, the celebration of the Lord's Day in memory of the resurrection of Christ dates undoubtedly from the apostolic age. Nothing short of apostolic precedent can account for the universal religious observance in the churches of the 2nd century. There's no dissenting voice. This custom is confirmed by the testimonies of the earliest post-apostolic writers as Barnabas, Ignatius, and Justin Martyr. So see the common practice. Here again he says, it appears therefore from the New Testament itself that Sunday was observed as a day of worship, a special commemoration of the resurrection, whereby the work of redemption was finished. The universal and uncontradicted Sunday observance in the 2nd century can only be explained in the fact that it has its roots in apostolic practice. So it's, again, It's clear. There was the New Testament teaching, there was the New Testament observance, and then there is from secular history, even observation. Christians, they did not observe the Sabbath generally. They observed the first day of the week. Now, using this word generally, there were some Jewish Christians who continued to observe Sabbath, including some heretical groups such as the Ebionites. In other words, there were some fringe, if you would, that did. Gradually, though, many began to view the Lord's Day as the Christian Sabbath. And this is what can get confusing. If you look up in a dictionary, an English dictionary, Sabbath, it may refer to that as a Christian Sabbath being on Sunday. There's no place in Scripture referring to the first day of the week as the Christian Sabbath. That's something kind of, as it were, man-made up. But I'll just say this. It confuses the issue. When the Bible is so explicit in Exodus 20, beginning of verse 8, that the Sabbath is the seventh day of the Lord, and we want to say the first day of the week is a Christian Sabbath, well, Sabbath, it refers to the seventh day. Exodus 20, verse 8. So why don't we just leave the name Sabbath out of it? The Bible actually does leave the name Sabbath out of what it's calling the day the Christians came together. Now, during the 4th, 5th, and 6th centuries, there were much controversy over whether Christians should keep the Sabbath or Saturday. And some sought to enjoin both the Sabbath and the Lord's Day on Christians. Others, especially the Puritans, began to call the Lord's Day Sunday as the Christian Sabbath. So there you find kind of that beginning as far as people calling it Christian Sabbath. And today many Catholics and Protestants routinely refer to Sunday as the Sabbath. Once again, it confuses the issue calling Sunday the Sabbath because the Sabbath is the seventh day, Sunday is the first day. It also confuses the issue by using the phrase Christian Sabbath because, once again, you use the word Sabbath, you imply the seventh day. Basically, there's three views of the Sabbath. One's a Sabbatarian view. That is that Saturday is the Sabbath, and that should be kept by Christians. And once again, a major religious group, the Seventh-day Adventists, hold to this. And then there are some fringe groups within various denominations, sometimes that do hold to the seventh day. Well, they are correct in saying that the Sabbath is Saturday, but they're wrong to say that Christians should keep the Sabbath. There's some who would use the phrase, call it Sunday Sabbath view. That is, they call the Sunday the Sabbath and say it should be kept by Christians. This view would be held by most Catholic, Orthodox, Protestant churches. And once again, the problem here is referring to the first day of the week as the Christian Sabbath. A day for Christians to worship, yes, first day of the week. The Sabbath, no, it's not, because the Sabbath is the seventh day, and the first day is Sunday. If we were to say, well, what's the biblical view? Well, the biblical view is that Saturday is the Sabbath, and period. Saturday is the Sabbath. Also that, as we've noticed, it was the Jews from the time of the giving the law of Moses that were to observe the Sabbath. Neither those Gentiles, nor as you get to New Testament times, Christians. It was not enjoined upon, commanded for Christians to keep the seventh day or the Sabbath. And so, the Sabbath is the seventh day of the week. From sundown as Jewish timekeeping, sundown on Friday to sundown on Saturday. Nowhere in the New Testament are Christians commanded to keep the Sabbath. And so that is kind of to Sabbath or not to Sabbath. And much of this material has been taken from a good brother that preaches down in Florida who put some excellent material out on the Sabbath day. As I mentioned, maybe you haven't had a question about this, But it is the case that it's been a long, long, long time that this has been really considered or taught from this pulpit. I know we're in Bible classes here at Easter Meadows. And something we should be aware of is the Bible does teach about it, Old Testament, New Testament. And so for the Jews from Moses onward until the time of Christ, certainly we'd say, yes, they were to Sabbath. For us, Gentiles, this side of the cross of Jesus, certainly not to Sabbath. If we could assist you this evening in your obedience, if there's a need to be baptized, if there's a need for prayer, we would be glad to serve you this evening if you'd come as we stand.